Alright, hello everyone, my name is Emily Dill and I'm going to be talking about the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So a few main points in the Yellow Wallpaper, as you may remember, are hysteria, healthcare, subordination in marriage, and also the freedom of expression, or really the lack thereof. So I'm going to start by talking about hysteria. And to me, a lot of what hysteria is summed up to, or what a lot of people tend to think about, is these crazy stories of Salem witch trials. Maybe that's just me, I don't know, that's where my brain went. So I have these images of women running around gossiping or having anxiety or just being teenagers freaked out and then getting charged as witches. So let's start by defining hysteria. And the definition of hysteria goes all the way back to 500 BC, with Hippocrates suggesting that female ailments could be summed up by the uterus, or what he noted, the womb. And you may remember us defining the wandering uterus. And this comes from him. He had this notion that whatever ailment a woman could come down with, it could be summed up by saying her uterus was wandering around and got stuck somewhere in her body, causing her to become sick in that part of her body. So let's say a sore throat, her uterus got stuck in her throat. Alright, so by the 1800s, women were increasingly being diagnosed with hysteria and symptoms of depression and anxiety. And that's what we see in the Yellow Wallpaper. A woman has become married and become very anxious because she has lost her creative outlets and feels very confined to her marriage and what the ideal woman of the time was supposed to be, a housewife and a mother. This depression only escalates after the birth of her first child. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, it's kind of an autobiographical story because she experienced the same thing. She was 3 months on rest cure after experiencing severe depression following her marriage that only escalated after the birth of her first child. So we have a quote from her that says she came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she could see over it. I think that that's a very telling line from how ineffective rest cure was. So rest cure was created in the 1870s by a neurologist named Silas Ware Mitchell. He was a prominent Philadelphia physician at the time, and he was the same physician that ended up treating Gilman herself. So he created this cure to deal with a condition with symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, headache, heart palpitations, high blood pressure, and depression. These were all symptoms associated with women. Now the cure calls for complete and total rest and isolation. So you could not only not go for an afternoon walk or continue on with your daily exercises or your daily routine, but you couldn't even dress yourself or feed yourself because the mere action of bringing a spoon from a bowl of soup to your mouth would be considered too much exercise for you. You weren't allowed to talk to anyone, not friends or family, so you wouldn't overexcite your mind. So this was the type of situation, and this was the type of conditions women were subjected to if they expressed any sort of anxiety or depression during that time. Again, remember the 18th century had this sense of ideal womanhood as being very content and being the housewife and the mother. So in the Yellow Wallpaper, we kind of have a story that bases fact as fiction. So I'm going to discuss 3 main points that I found really interesting in the Yellow Wallpaper. And number 1 will be the psychological costs of women's situations. Number 2, the women's role in economy. And number 3, reproductive rights. So let's start by looking at the psychological costs of women's situations. The main character of the Yellow Wallpaper was most likely suffering from postpartum depression. Now, I've read this story before, I think when I was a freshman in college, and I remember thinking, well, this woman is suffering from postpartum depression. The worst thing she could be doing is being stuck in bed, not able to read or write or do the things that she loves to do, and she's not even allowed to be around her child because it's considered too much exercise. That is the worst way to treat depression, and that isolation and being cut off from your hobbies and your passions, and also from the world and being able to go out and communicate with other individuals is very inhibiting to your recovery. But in the 1800s, it was being prescribed as the main cure. So the psychological effects on women were that not only were they husbands and being forced to stay in bed for months at a time. So today, many women experience the same symptoms and the same guilt and pressure to maintain the perfect image of wife and mother, as well as the businesswoman. Although women are physically healthier than men in most aspects, it seems that they make up for the superiority with an unstable mind, or at least that's what we like to be told. There's now a thing that I like to call the Wonder Woman effect. It's where women are supposed to be not only smart, educated, successful career women, but also the perfect wife and the perfect mother. So that in itself creates a lot of pressure for women to maintain, and I think this in turn makes their mental health suffer. So not only do you have women like the main character in the Yellow Wallpaper being cut off from their daily routines and sensing or feeling a sense of confinement to being only the wife and the mother, and that being the cause of their depression, we now have women facing, well, not only do I have to do this, this, and this, but I also have to do this, this, and this, and it's too much and it's overwhelming, and it causes their mental health to suffer. So that being said, my second point is the role of women in the economy. So as of 2016, the United States Department of Labor estimated that 74.6% of women are currently working in the labor force. So with this much women working now, you have to think about the life that the main character was subjected to in the Yellow Wallpaper. She was probably a writer, someone who was used to having creativity as her main source of freedom and her personal gain, and that being robbed from her. But now you have so many women, well, back then men were the ones that were allowed to go out into the world and be the breadwinners and experience an education and experience a career, but now we have 74.6% of all women in the workforce. According to national reports, women perform 2/3 of the world's work hours, receive 1/10 of the world's income, and own less than 1/100th of the world's property. So now women were experiencing this shift where men were able to go out into the workforce and lay claim to property and experience their own lives. Well, women are able to do the same, and yet we still have an inequality in that. I think that there's something not being recognized about the work that women put into the economy. Women make 75 cents for every man's dollar. So there's still a stigma about the capabilities of women and what women are able to handle, regardless of their education, regardless of their abilities. So if you add the importance of maintaining a career and a social life outside of the family, you also add that to all of the expectations of maintaining domestic roles. So I think that that goes along with the challenges women face with their mental health. And it brings me to, and the third point in discussing the Yellow Wallpaper is women's reproductive rights. So Gilman's depressive episode escalated after the birth of her first child, as well as the main character. This is when we see the main character's depression escalate. So you have to think if she was able to have access to birth control, if she was able to have access to birth control or contraceptives and a sense of planning, she would be able to put herself and her mental health at the forefront and be able to take care of herself before having a child. So a lot of the problems with female health care is the social stigma surrounding them. Back then as well as now, we see a constant interference with medical care based on social stigmas and cultural stigmas such as religion and other cultural aspects. I think this is very unprofessional, and it makes you question how trustworthy your doctors are. In my opinion, there's no room for politics in the operating room. So women are at the mercy of healthcare providers, and unfortunately most of them are bound by legislation that has nothing to do with their patients' current situations. This is a contradiction that we saw repeatedly again and again in Birthright, A War Story, the film documenting how abortion laws have affected women who are just trying to get through a pregnancy, even if it is a wanted pregnancy. So the first story we were showed in that film was a woman who, her and her husband were planning the birth of their second child, and unfortunately they lost that child at 20 weeks, and she was unable to have a D&C and finish what was medically necessary, and she was forced to carry out that pregnancy at the risk of her own life. And I think that instances like that are what makes women's health care such a topic of interest right now. So by looking at the Yellow Wallpaper and discussing some of the issues that were faced not only in the 1800s, but today, we have to discuss women's mental health, and we have to discuss the importance of continuing the conversation and keeping it open for changes and new things to occur. So that has been my review and my lecture on the Yellow Wallpaper. I hope it was informative, and hopefully you shared some of the views that I found interesting about the Yellow Wallpaper. Thanks.